Hello, everybody. This is the other Professor Walker. I subbed a few weeks ago, you might remember, and I was asked by your professor to cover radicals this week, the first part of radicals anyway, campus radicals of the 1960s and the origins of radical politics out of higher education. And so, yeah, let's discuss that and focus on the origins of radical left-wing politics. It had been around before in American political thought. Certainly there were anarchist organizations and socialist radicals and that kind of thing. Let's look in particular at the most recent source of radical politics coming from university students and think about what this means in the broad scope of American political thought, and especially how it relates to higher education in general. It's a theme that's come up throughout the course. And let's think about what it means for what we'll talk about next week, what you guys will discuss next week, conservatism. So let's turn to radicals. Let's go back to the University of Michigan, late 1950s, early 1960s. It's an old university going back to the early 19th century that had been a private institution for several years. It became one of the land-grant colleges following the Morrill Act in the Civil War era, and became, at this point, kind of a flagship public university. This was like the very best that states could do with their higher education institutions. And it was an impressive place. It was very big, had a huge endowment, and above all, it led the way in the advancement, the combination of what a university was supposed to be, the advancement of knowledge on one hand, and the distribution of degrees on the other for worthy students. And so that's what it was. The knowledge that was passed on was understood as specialized. It was all about the specialized majors. This was a development in higher education that had taken place over a period of time. It's incredible to think. If you look back at the earlier history of American higher education, really of higher education throughout history, it was not specialized. It was about the education of the human person. Of course, it was deeply religious in the early days, but even if it wasn't, the point was to give people a liberal education that had to do with the full depth of their humanity, to read and study and contemplate the best that has been thought and said. All of that was pretty well rejected by the early 20th century, by major universities that said, we need to give up on the liberal arts college and the liberal arts education of the human person and turn instead to specializations. That's the only way you can advance knowledge, after all, is to divide it up into areas of study and make each one of those the highest level of research and writing, and bring students into those fields, which in turn prepares them for their careers. And that is what the university eventually became. University of Michigan led the way in that. This had some important political significance. For several years, a lot of the arguments for specialized majors, especially in the social sciences, which were very, very popular at this time, social sciences being psychology, sociology, and economics, and of course political science, these disciplines existed to train up specialists, not so much in their academic fields of research, but more importantly, to become civil servants in the government, whether federal or state or municipal. This was the ideal of the Great Society. It had been that way during the Great Depression era and the New Deal. Franklin Roosevelt was big on the brain trust of bringing on all kinds of economists to help craft the New Deal policies of his era. But now it had become much more the norm, and probably the most important speech delivered at the University of Michigan at its commencement address in 1964 for the graduating class came from President Lyndon Johnson. Johnson saw himself as perfecting the New Deal with the Great Society. And a long speech, but one part of it he says, "We are going to assemble the best thought and brightest knowledge from all over the world to find these answers, the answers to society's problems." And by that he meant poverty and social inequalities, civil rights, and all these kinds of things. We're going to bring on the experts to help implement these things. And he also meant science and technology and the space race against the Soviets that had been started under Kennedy's administration before him. And that meant the university had to supply the best and the brightest. And that meant it had to have highly trained specialists ready to serve the Great Society through the government. Johnson says, "I intend to establish working groups to prepare a series of conferences and meetings on cities and urban problems, on natural beauty and environmental preservation, on the quality of education, and on all these other emerging challenges. From these studies, he says, we will begin to set out our course toward the Great Society. And what that means is we need you, students, you graduates, with your specialized degrees, to staff the administration that will aid the Great Society at the state and federal level, mostly at the federal level, coming from Johnson's point of view. So that was the idea. Universities existed to train up civil servants. And sure, you could study, humanities and English and art and things like that and go into education, sure, but what we truly need are those specializing in the social sciences to work for the government. And that was kind of the mission of University of Michigan and a lot of other universities around the country about this time. You learn specialized disciplines for a very specific career, ideally in government or maybe something else. At the same time, the spirit of the 1960s was starting to take shape, and at about the same time, there was a visit, University of Michigan, from Martin Luther King, famous civil rights leader. Just a year before his March on Washington speech, his letter from Birmingham jail, he came to speak at this packed-out auditorium. Lots of students really interested in what he had to say. A lot of them, remember, were the ones who went down to Alabama and Mississippi on their summer break. So other kids are partying it up at the beach. What are they doing? They're joining the Freedom Riders. They're sitting in with the civil rights protesters. They're being attacked by dogs and sprayed by water cannons and put in jail. And so King was a great inspiration for drawing a lot of these students there. And so you notice a certain tension here then between a university that is intended to train up civil servants with specialized majors on one hand, and at the same time, a student culture that was much more interested in danger, in risk, in doing radical and provocative things like marching with the Freedom Riders and civil rights. So it happened at the University of Michigan that a group of students pursuing their degrees found themselves really disenchanted with what they were doing there. And so you had the student organization known as the Students for a Democratic Society, SDS. Lots of organizations like this in the early 60s. This is probably one of the most famous ones, though. The key figure in SDS was a guy named Tom Hayden. Talk about his story a little bit more later, but he was the one who was largely responsible for drafting the official statement of SDS, the Port Huron Statement. It has a real problem with the conventional understanding of university life and what it meant to be a student. Really didn't like this idea that we were here to learn specialized majors, or if we weren't, we were here to make our social connections and get our degree that gets us a fancy job later. No, there's got to be more to it than that, says SDS and Tom Hayden. So let's have a look at this remarkable document, which is widely considered to be the founding document of the 1960s. It had a lot of contributors. Hayden kind of organized the final draft and wrote some of the key parts, but there were actually a lot of people who contributed to it. And through the 1960s and all the counterculture and everything, it was a great point of bragging to say, yes, I helped with the Port Huron Statement too. Oh, I did too. So let's have a look at this founding document of 60s radicalism. Page 98 of the packet. We are people of this generation, bred in at least modest comfort, housed now in universities, looking uncomfortably upon the world we inherit. Growing up in the 1950s, it was a wholesome time. It was a great deal of innocence, especially for white kids, obviously. He's speaking mostly from their point of view. But yeah, we were kids. When we were kids, the United States was the wealthiest and strongest country in the world, the only one with the atomic bomb, the least scarred by modern war, as everybody else was after World War II, an initiator of the United Nations that we thought would distribute Western influence throughout the world, freedom and equality for every individual, government of, by, and for the people. All these American mantras just seemed so perfectly self-evident to us. Everything was just bright and cheery. The world was great. It's a good time to be a kid in the 1950s. And then you grow up. And then as you grow in the 1950s and go off to high school, you learn a little bit more about the world, and you find out that it's not quite as rosy as you thought it was. You find out about racial bigotry, Jim Crow laws in the South, the treatment of black kids, and the fact that they have to go to segregated schools. Little by little, your innocence is sapped away, and you become horrified at the realities of what it is to actually live in the modern world. You face the terrifying reality of the Cold War. Remember, these are the kids who grew up doing duck and cover drills under their desks. That kind of has a psychological impact on you after a while, where you start to think that the bomb can go off any second. It really makes you feel like the world is way more unstable than you thought it was. Remember, too, in 1962, this is just a matter of weeks after, it was written that winter, a matter of weeks after the Cuban Missile Crisis in October of that year. So yeah, it's fresh in everybody's minds that we came that close to just nuclear annihilation. The bomb is real. It brings this sort of awareness that we ourselves and our friends and millions of abstract others, and the Russians, we know more directly because of our common peril that we might die any second. Does this explain a bit of the anxiety that you hear in the Port Huron Statement? And it gets worse. Totalitarianism around the world, what it's like living in the Soviet Union. It's terrible. It's distinctly undemocratic. They're right about that. There's a lot of other fears that shaped the 1960s, things that we sort of forget about today. And the document mentions them kind of in passing, but there was, remember too, the population scare of the 60s. The fear that there's just way too many people in the world compared to those who can actually be fed, that we seem to be approaching some kind of crisis. And the book that really scared everybody to death was The Population Bomb that came out a few years later in 1968. But still, it was an idea that was simmering for quite a bit through the 1960s, that population is going to outpace food production, and we are approaching some kind of global catastrophe. So the anxiety then of the 60s generation has a lot of factors to it. Port Huron Statement acknowledges all of these things. And so the sense of the passing of an American golden age, the possibility that all the things we thought held in the future, that the future held for us, just weren't actually there, that there's a great deal of risk, that this generation faces a catastrophe like no prior generation of Americans ever had before. The novel that really resonated with kids in the early 1960s, and the statement doesn't mention it, but it's worth considering, was Catcher in the Rye by J.D. Salinger. Actually came out in 1951, didn't get a lot of attention, but the 60s generation, it really meant a lot to them because it was all about that loss of innocence, of the sort of golden innocence of childhood, especially in the prosperous 1950s. And then you grow up and you're corrupted. And so we follow Holden. You might remember the character if you've read it in high school, wandering around New York City, looking back on childhood and realizing that, he's waking up to the horrible realities of corruption of adulthood. That's it for the 60s kids. That's definitely the spirit of the Port Huron Statement, that the golden age of American life turns out to be a total illusion, and we're really anxious about that. We're the last generation able to experiment with living, they say. It seems like the future has narrowed the possibilities for us way, way down. We're told, of course, that America will muddle through, that we'll press on. And along with that comes this kind of conservative attitude, as they say on page 99, first column, of fear of change itself, since change might smash whatever invisible framework seems to hold back chaos, chaos from them now. And so we sink down because of our fear of change. We sink down into the most dreaded concept of the 1960s, apathy. Apathy is just sort of, we atrophy, our souls sort of wither. The fact that each individual sees apathy in his fellows perpetuates the common reluctance to organize for change. And there's not a lot of interest in organization and radical groups and radical protest and shaking up the status quo, but there is for this generation. The dominant institutions are complex enough to blunt the minds of their potential critics and entrench enough to swiftly dissipate and entirely repel the energies of protest and reform, thus limiting human expectations. And so we're approaching this point in history where it doesn't look like great changes will happen anymore. Our souls are just becoming kind of flat. And we're okay with that. But again, not this group, not Students for a Democratic Society. Some would have us believe that Americans feel contentment amidst their prosperity. Yeah, maybe a lot do. Maybe there are a lot that are perfectly fine with the status quo. and able to look the other way at racial segregation and racial injustice and the threat of the bomb. But no, those who are awakened, those who are aware, those who are, grieve their loss of innocence, they're the ones ready to face the dark realities that lie ahead. We're told that there's no alternative to the present condition. There's no other way to do American life. No, there has to be a way, says Students for Democratic Society, and that is what we intend to lay out in this document. What must be done? They say on page 99, that second column, making values explicit. That's really important. Not so much making values just or true or what's good for human society or human life. No, making them just explicit, loud, right? In your face, free speech kind of stuff. We must make values explicit. That's the only way you can sort of break the sort of apathy that seems to overtake everyone else. It's an initial task in establishing alternatives, right? Questions and doubts. It's an activity that has been devalued and corrupted, especially by, as they'll say, university life. The conventional moral terms of the age, the political moralities, all these mantras of the free world and people's democracies and all that. What does that really mean if it's just part of the rhythm of American life? No, it needs to be shaken up. It needs to be shocked. But neither has our experience in the universities brought us moral enlightenment. Our professors and administrators sacrifice controversy to public relations. Their curriculums change more slowly than the living events of the world. Their skills in silence are purchased by investors in the arms race. The fact that a lot of members of university boards and major donors would be military contractors. And remember too, this is 1962. This is before Vietnam, so you can kind of see what's coming. But yeah, passion is called unscholastic. The questions we might want raised. What's really important in life? What is a good life anyway? Can we live in a different and better way? If we wanted to change society, how might we change it? These questions are not considered worthy because they are not of a fruitful, empirical, meaning scientific nature. And for this reason, they are brushed aside. Wow, what an indictment of the university. Shouldn't universities be places where you ask those questions of what a good life is, about how we might change society for the better? No, instead, all university life is a great deal of rote memorization. It's intriguing to look back at yearbook photos from this era, late 50s, early 60s, where everybody sort of fits a certain mold. Personalities just seem a little bit flat. They look like little adults. They don't have a lot of free-spiritedness. University life itself reflected a great deal of this. The large lecture halls packed out with students, and the professor stands up front and rambles on, and he'll never learn his name. You'll never have a conversation with him. He wants you to take notes and prepare for the exam, and the exam is taken with a Scantron, where you fill in the bubbles, and that determines whether or not you pass, and then you go on to the next class. Your classes might be a little bit smaller once you declare your major, but it's the same sort of thing. You're lectured at. Conversation isn't all that important compared to just rote memorization and preparation. You've got to disseminate the knowledge. Of course, that's what I'm doing to you right now over this audio recording, but it's because of the coronavirus. It's not because I'm trying to squelch conversation, of course. And like I said, I'll be interested to see what you say on the forum. But still, this was the spirit of the 60s higher education. And this was thought to be the legacy of progressive university education. This is how you'd train specialists who'd go off into their technical fields and do magnificent things for the state, for the politically organized community. Where's the passion in this? You can imagine sitting in the back of these classrooms, bored out of your mind, taking notes, but wondering, when are we ever going to talk about something interesting or important or dangerous and provocative? The vision of the old left, they point out, was exactly that university-trained people would become civil servants who would help coordinate the Great Society, as Lyndon Johnson called it. But that meant a great deal of specialization. What we have is, he talks about the old left, it has been said that our liberal and socialist predecessors were plagued by vision without program, while our generation is plagued with program without vision. All around us, there's an astute grasp of method and technique. The committee, the ad hoc group, the lobbyist, the hard and soft sell, the make, the projected image. But, if pressed critically, such expertise is incompetent to explain its implicit ideals. It's all about know-how and technique. It has very little to do with what the ends and the purposes of life actually are. It's highly fashionable to identify oneself by old categories, or by naming a respected political figure, by explaining how we would vote in this or that election. But all that is fading away. There's great doubt now about specialization of human activity, especially after we've seen what this kind of bureaucratic training can do. Isn't this exactly what led to the Holocaust in Nazi Germany? Highly trained chemists and urban engineers. Indeed, most of the SS was educated in high-end German universities, and they used their knowledge and their technical expertise for terrible evil. So maybe we should learn to ask the important questions about what's good just as much as we learn technical skills and bureaucratic administration. But modern American universities don't seem interested in that. So let's take our stand, student radicals, they say. Top of page 100. We regard men as infinitely precious and possessed of unfulfilled capacities for reason, freedom, and love. There speaks the 1960s. You can really see what's coming here later in the decade. In affirming these principles, we are aware of the countering, perhaps dominant conceptions. The conception of the university, the conception of the modern state and the Great Society, the thing that's dominated the horrors of the 20th century, that man is a thing to be manipulated, that he is inherently incapable of directing his own affairs. No, they say, we oppose this depersonalization that reduces human beings to the status of things. Look at the brutalities of the 20th century. Isn't that the great lesson? The more we think people can be manipulated by experts, the more unhuman they become, the more degraded they find themselves. No, they say, the radicals insist that men have unrealized potential for self-cultivation and self-direction. What they deeply crave, and here's a really important 60s term, what they really crave is personal authenticity, right? Because again, think back to the yearbook photos, think back to just rote, memorized university life, late 50s, early 60s. It's all about fitting within the mold. It's all about doing the thing you're just supposed to do without ever asking why. Authenticity is what's underneath that. It's when real personality and creativity come out, when you say something daring and provocative. It's a quality of mind not compulsively driven by a sense of powerlessness, nor one which unthinkingly adopts status values, nor one which represses all threats to its habits, but one which has full, spontaneous access to present and past experiences, an excitement about exploration, and above all, a willingness to learn, like really learn, not just memorize and regurgitate information and receive a degree, but to question and doubt and explore, right? It's almost like this call for a return to the childhood adventure that learning really ought to be, even at the university level. But it's not what it is in modern universities, they realize. What they hope will come out of this is a sense, though, of community. Let's reconnect what we're really doing as a group of students, instead of just sitting in our classrooms and spending all our time in small talk. Let's face the consequences of modern life, its loneliness, estrangement, isolation. These things describe the vast distance between man and man today. These dominant tendencies cannot be overcome by better personnel management, and here you go, nor by improved gadgets. The iPhone is still about 50 years away here. No, we want real face-to-face, vibrant, provocative, exciting community. But again, the establishment does not accept this. Here's a great example. Look at university architecture of the 1960s. Would you describe this as warm and welcoming and inspiring? It was so ugly. And of course, it went out of style very, very quickly. It's funny to look at a lot of big university campuses today. You still see these buildings that bear the mark of the early 60s, and it kind of stayed the same through the 70s. Kudos to Colgate University for not following this trend. But the architecture had this purpose of making education neutral, making it objective and pure. Beautiful Gothic architecture or New England style architecture like we see at Colgate or other schools, that was kind of too value laden. That assumed too much about the nature of beauty and goodness. No, it was the blank, white, large, cavernous buildings of the 1960s that seemed to capture better the neutrality that education ought to inspire. What's it like then to be a student in this situation? I touched on it a few times, but what we see in the student body is indeed a great deal of that apathy and acceptance that a college degree is, just to get you a job, get you a degree that gets you a job, that gets you a career, gets you ahead, helps you save lots of money, moving ahead, fast forward until you die. It's a very dreary understanding of education. And they admit, indeed, a lot of their classmates look at it that way, and they don't know what to do about that. But there ought to be a student movement that knows how to shake things up, and that is what Students for a Democratic Society will be. If student movements for change are rarities still on the campus, trying to break up the apathy, right? What is commonplace there? The real campus, the familiar campus, is a place of private people engaged in their notorious inner emigration, passing through their classes and receiving their degree. It is a place of commitment to business as usual, getting ahead, playing it cool, having lots of fun, and then studying, but never really asking, what is your life for? What can we do to shake up civilization? No, it's a place of mass affirmation of the twist, the popular dance in that era, but mass reluctance toward controversial public stance. Rules are accepted as inevitable. Bureaucracy is just circumstances, irrelevance to scholarship, selflessness as martyrdom, politics as just another way to make people, and an unprofitable one too. No, we want to take risks. We want dangerous goals. We want excitement. We just want to take a big sledgehammer to these ugly buildings and smash them because they're just so hideous. We want to just shake up the bureaucracy, shake up the culture, shake up our fellow students, break them out of their apathy, and show them that there's a better way to be a student and a better way to enter a democratic society. Again, to contrast though, what are we up against? How does the university respond to these things? See on page 101. Academic life contains reinforcing counterparts to the way in which extracurricular life is organized. Indeed, universities at this time kept tight control over student government and student clubs, making sure that the students always fit within the guidelines of what was expected. The academic world is founded in a teacher-student relation analogous to the parent-child relation. You're here to be managed, young people, because you don't know how to manage yourselves. So sit down and take your notes and stop protesting. Further, academia includes radical separation of the student from the material of study. Right? Knowledge is treated as something to just cram into your head and regurgitate on an exam, instead of something precious and valuable and inspiring interest and fascination. No, that which is studied, the social reality, is objectified to sterility. That's a great description of university life. Sterile. Dividing the student from life, just as he is reinstated in active involvement by the deans controlling student government. The specialization of function and knowledge. Back to that specialization, right? Choose your major. That's gonna be your training for your career. Specialization of function and knowledge, admittedly necessary to our complex technological and social structure, has produced an exaggerated compartmentalization of study and understanding. What if you're just interested in a variety of things? What if you're interested in what's really important? Too bad, you got to choose your major and choose your special field and discipline and learn all the technical methods and skills, and off you go. Most horrifying of all, coordinating all of this is the bureaucracy. All the academic bureaucracy that manages crowds of students, that manages the classes you take, that certifies your degree. And none of them are interested at all in anything passionate, anything that can shake up the world and change society. And that's the real issue. What does this mean for society beyond? Universities have always been the keepers of culture and keepers of civilization. If this is what they are becoming, then they're just going to perpetuate the drab, sterile, bureaucratic kind of society that Lyndon Johnson seems to value, that the Great Society and all the administration seems to think is the highest ideal for American life. Of memorization, of organization, of methods of managing people, instead of letting them direct themselves, instead of unleashing democracy as a matter of adventure. So, what you really see in this document is a radical turn against the old vision of the left, the old left. It wasn't like they were revolting against something conservative. That's really important to see, and you'll really see the distinction next week when you turn to Russell Kirk, who was a conservative. They might call the university establishment conservative, but it wasn't exactly. No, it was just the old progressivism. It was the old New Deal, Great Society, kind of traced its heritage all the way back to Edward Bellamy, really. But here you see the Port Huron Statement saying, no, we don't want government as the answer. We want the people to be the answer, the people themselves, protesting, taking to the streets. And the university ought to be the place that cultivates this in its graduates. And so radicalism is born. Lots of campus radicals you could talk about in this era. Probably one of the most famous ones, though, was Mario Savio out in California, the University of Berkeley, in the Bay Area. Savio was real radical. I mean, he was all about doing the most provocative thing he could. And yeah, he had much the same problem that Students for a Democratic Society had at the University of Michigan. The fact that student government and student clubs and student organization was closely regulated and monitored and frequently shut down, especially as they tried to champion things like civil rights. Again, these were the kids who would take their summer vacation and go down to Alabama and march with the Freedom Riders. They were all about demanding their free speech on campus, and in defiance of university regulations, Mario Savio and his supporters would set up the big speakers on campus and the huge clubs, and all the hordes of students would come out and demand loosening of the rules imposed on student groups, opening up the possibility of free speech and free exchange of ideas. And for this, Savio was heavily persecuted. He was hauled off stage several times in front of his huge audience by campus police. The microphones shut down. But still, you could really see the radical spirit against the system, the sort of raging against the machine taking shape in the 1960s. What was the promise of the old liberalism, though? If you look at the Great Society, if you look at the New Deal, and again, going back to Edward Bellamy, you guys read, it's a very clear image of the end of history. Bellamy was all about the end of history, where social organization through the state becomes the order of human life, and every individual finds their place within that whole, and we live happily ever after. That was the dream of organization, all the way through the Progressive era and the New Deal and the Great Society. And again, the kids of the 1960s wanted none of it. Savio captures very well, though, that vision of the end of history. He talks about going down, like we said, a lot of them, to Alabama to march with the Freedom Riders. And they're met with this sort of resistance of the state, especially Bull Connor, right, and all of his police force and all of the firefighters and just the organization of the state that existed, supposed to be for health and safety, but were instead used to squash the protesters. That seems to be the future, the bureaucratic state of drab old men who had no vision and no passion and just wanted to punish the young for dreaming and trying to change society for the better. What you find, though, in both cases is unresponsive bureaucracy. They hide behind the rules, right? They lay on the layers of bureaucratic complexity so they can basically enforce power against those who wish to speak truth with passion. Just as it is in Alabama, so it is in American university campuses, he insisted. And so it happened, a lot of these big demonstrations and speeches, that university administrators were compelled to come out and respond to the student protesters. So the bureaucrats, looking very awkward, had to tell them, you're all in violation of this code and that regulation, campus conduct, blah, blah, blah. If you don't vacate the premises immediately, you will be expelled. There's a procedure for petitioning the administration to get what you want, and there are student clubs able to do that, but this is not the way. Just drab, boring, bureaucratic speak, right? This is a sign of the automation that is overtaking society, Savio says. This is the kind of automated government response to passion that is going to squelch anything that could make society adventurous again. These are the people, though, who believe in the end of history, that we've reached the end, that American life is doing it as well as it can possibly be done by the late 50s and early 60s, that administration is the way forward, and we must shut up and get used to that. And Savio says no way. He says, top of page 102, second column, on campus, students are not about to accept it as a fact that the university has ceased evolving and it's in its final state of perfection. No, that students and faculty are respectively raw material and employees, or that the university is to be autocratically run by unresponsive bureaucrats. Here is the real contradiction. The bureaucrats hold that history has ended, that it's over, that we've reached the pinnacle of American civilization, and anybody who tries to shake it up or change anything is just going to destroy all that we've achieved. No, Savio says, history cannot end. The university cannot accept that. He says, a few paragraphs down, the university is the place where people begin seriously to question the conditions of their existence. Again, back to the questions, right? Like we saw in Port Huron Statement, that spirit of exploration and challenge. They want to raise the issue of whether they can be combined to the society that they've been born into. After a long period of apathy during the 1950s, students have begun not only to question, but they have arrived at answers, to act on those answers. This is part of the growing understanding among many people in America that history has not ended, and we must not accept that it has ended, that a better society, an even better one than we have, is possible, and that it is worth dying for. And of course, isn't that the greatest question? What would you die for? What principle would you lay down your life for? If there isn't anything, then what's worth living for? This free speech fight, says Savio, points up the fascinating aspect of contemporary campus life. Students are permitted to talk all they want, so long as their speech has no consequences. And that's a very interesting point. What's the value of free speech if the speech itself is not in some way dangerous? Dangerous in that it can shake up the status quo. If you're just talking and your speech is protected, what's the value of that? No, how about a speech that actually makes stuff happen? So he concludes, the last paragraph, it is a bleak scene, the end of history. It is all a lot of us have to look forward to. Society today provides no challenge. Where's the thing that's going to shake everything up? Where's the challenge and the way forward? That's what we want. That explains the sit-ins and the protests and the demonstrations. No, we don't want a future that's no longer exciting. We don't want it sterilized, a utopia that's sterilized and full of automated contentment. We don't want futures and careers. We want something dangerous and edgy and challenging, not just to society, but to ourselves. So we get a very clear picture of early 60s radicalism. So you think about these kids, they grow up in the 1950s, they're very straight-laced, they're very clean-cut and very straightforward. The ideas are radical, but still they're kind of stuck in their rut. By the later 1960s, things change. The hair gets longer, the outfits get wilder, and the changes demanded have a lot more to do with the sort of not so much bringing about a democratic society, but just dynamiting everything considered normal, shaking it up in a very radical kind of way. And so we turn to our third founding radical. There's a lot of different people I'm leaving out here, but Jerry Ruben is exactly what you expected him to look like, right? Um, he was really wild guy, prankster, not just one who gave these passionate speeches denying the end of history, but doing everything he possibly could to just shake up the status quo, showing up inside respectable buildings and meetings with an automatic rifle. It wasn't loaded, but he just did it to shock people. He was invited on all kinds of talk shows. If you ever want to get a really good experience of Jerry Ruben, pull up on YouTube the Phil Donahue interview with Jerry Ruben. He was stoned out of his mind most of the time. Plus, he did a lot of LSD. Indeed, he represented the real counterculture movement of the 1960s, openly advocating for drugs, calling for a revolution that was all about the drugs. His book was called Do It. The title was just Do It. Scenarios of Revolution was the subtitle. And it's a wild read. So we chose the shorter read here, the Yippie Manifesto. What is the Yippie Manifesto about in 1968? He says, we are calling the bluff on the myths of America. So much like the other radicals, we're not accepting the status quo anymore. The end of history is not possible, nor is it even desirable. Now, once the myth is exposed, the structure behind it crumbles like sand. Chaos results. People must create new realities. So there you have it, right? All the doubts you see expressed in the Port Huron Statement and in Mario Savio's speech, now there are answers, and it's just about destroy. Not destroy in the sort of bloody, devastating sense, but destroy the structure of society, the lies we've been told. In the process, he says, we create new myths, and these new myths forecast the future. In America in 1969, old myths can be destroyed overnight, and new ones created overnight because of the power of television. By making communication instantaneous, television telescopes the revolution by centuries. What might have taken 100 years will now take 20. The fast pace of modern life makes things far more possible. So yeah, Rubin reads like a wild ride. You can tell in the Yippie Manifesto. He's really kind of all over the place, and a lot of his ideas don't really hang together. He writes practically in aphorism, stream of consciousness. You notice, of course, he's very fond of the F word. Used it a lot to great effect. I took the liberty of editing it out. But yeah, so what are some of his main points? What about education? Back to that. Our battleground, he says, is on American university campuses. You see in the second column, page 103. White middle-class youth are strategically located in the high schools and colleges of this country. They are our power bases. If one day 100 campuses were closed in a nationally coordinated rebellion, we would force the President of the United States to sue for peace. As long as we are in school, we are in prisons. Think back to those ugly buildings, right? Schools are voluntary jails. We must liberate ourselves. Dig the geography of a university, 60s term, dig it, right? You can always tell what the rulers have up their sleeves when you check out the physical environment they create. The buildings tell you how to behave. It was often called brutalist architecture. It's meant to make you feel small and insignificant. So, and indeed, it is all about control. I'm pretty sure that's the federal building in downtown Boston. What is the code of university life, though? Listen to your professor. He teaches you. Keep your place. Don't stretch out. Don't lie on the floor. Don't relax. Don't speak out of turn. Don't take off your clothes. Don't get emotional. Let the mind rule the body. Let the needs of the classroom rule the mind. Conform, conform, conform. Classrooms, he says, are totalitarian environments. The main purpose of school and education in America is to force you to accept and love authority and to distrust your own spontaneous emotions. How can you grow in such an overstructured environment? You can't. Schools, he says, are not for learning. Really, good classroom environment is when the students sit in a circle. That it's a conversation. It's sort of a democratic process. And yeah, the teacher's there, but he's part of the conversation. Ruben's got a point there. Indeed, I greatly prefer sitting in a circle. Sometimes I have to lecture just because of the size of the classroom. But still, he says, to try to shock the system, just scream out the F word in the middle of class sometime. So we are organized, a university of the flesh. 4 of us go into the classroom, we sit in the middle of class, and the lecture is about thinking. And so we take off our shirts, he says, and we smoke joints and start kissing each other. A lot of students get nervous. This goes on for 10 or 15 minutes. Finally, a girl says, the guys in the back are causing a distraction, right? And the prof says, well, I agree with that. I think that if you're not here to hear, then hear what I'm saying. And so we shout, you can't separate thinking from loving. So shake it up any way you can. The universities are going to be the places that start this kind of revolution. And it starts with these simple tactics of just shocking the environment. He calls it rightly, though, if you think about it, the way that university life was in the 1960s. A Ph.D. is very often this ticket to being a social elite. And yet, there's an anti-intellectualism in America because the professors have created an artificial environment. That's why the average working guy does not respect college professors. The university is a protective and plastic scene, shielding people from the realities of life, the reality of suffering, of ecstasy, of struggle. The university converts the agony of life into the scrutiny of words and books. The questions don't get asked. The challenging experiences just aren't really there. This indeed has a lot to do, again, with the specialization of knowledge that seemed to be the wave of the future if you go back to the early progressive reforms of the university and the vision of Lyndon Johnson when he spoke at the University of Michigan. Jerry Ruben, along with several others, including some of the authors of the Port Huron Statement, were involved in the protest outside the Democratic National Convention in 1968 in Chicago. As Hubert Humphrey received the nomination as Lyndon Johnson's successor after he decided not to run, the riots broke up outside. All the anti-war protesters in the Vietnam era were hoping that Eugene McCarthy would get the nomination. And when he didn't, the demonstrators were ready, and they sparked this massive demonstration, the huge protest that went on. And the pictures from Chicago of police and riot gear beating up on the protesters were all over the country. It was televised, just a huge disgrace for the Democratic National Convention. Well, Jerry Ruben was right there on the ground, and so too was Tom Hayden, the guy who helped draft the Port Huron Statement. You see him there in the back row, Jerry Ruben sitting in the front in the yellow shirt, and explaining themselves why they staged this protest. Abby Hoffman was also there, and some of the key figures of the radical counterculture movement that had been at the radical politics game for a very long time, well before Vietnam even broke out. But he describes the scene. You see he refers to police officers as pigs over and over again. But all of his doubts about the establishment, when you push the establishment just a little bit, it hits back 10 times as hard with the system. And so Rubin really called for this total dismantling of everything we thought was normal and ordinary about American life. There really was a deep need to just break it all down, and through that, unleash a sort of new order of the ages. A lot of it had to do with drugs. A lot of it had to do with these extreme forms of liberation. But still, you had to hand it to him. Something had grown a little bit stale about the system at the time. Maybe there had to be some kind of way out. So it was in the 1960s, early 70s, the attitude about campus activism and campus speech. This was the only way to sort of unleash a better world and overcome this oppressive system that we had constructed for ourselves in the earlier progressive era. So, what's the status of radicalism these days? Campus speech isn't so much about unleashing ideas as it is opposing speech that we don't like, that it normalizes hate, that any university that allows an open, free form of discussion is inevitably allowing hateful speech to occur, and that needs to be shut down. It's an interesting twist. For a very long time, you'd hear about these violations of free speech on campus, and most of the time they came from university administrators. It's only been about since 2015 we saw a radical shift of the students not fighting for free speech, but trying to stop free speech. What would Mario Savio think of that? Only guess. When we come back, let's take these general ideas about liberation of the campus radicals of the 1960s, about doubts about the system that had been constructed over the years of the New Deal and the Great Society. And let's consider what this means for the more conventional understandings of human nature when it comes to women and sex differences, which comes to be called gender. We'll have a look at The Feminine Mystique by Betty Friedan. What if everything we think is natural about femininity actually isn't? What if what we mean by being a woman is something made up by society, and in particular by men? And what will happen if we tear it all down? And think about the same thing when it comes to race. The way that W.B. Du Bois understood race, what does this mean for the radical understanding of race that emerges? And we'll look at Stokely Carmichael. So we'll see you then.